In most cases, the patient who relapses looks at themselves as a failure. But I also want to point out something important to all of you is that in my experience over all these years involved with this, many of people counseling patients to quit if there's a relapse think of themselves as a failure. So as a result, many healthcare professionals, no matter what your profession, don't like doing cessation counseling because of that fact. So I want to point out right at the beginning here that relapse is a natural part of this process. Now, that doesn't mean we want to encourage it, but that it does happen. And how often it happens and what we do with it all depends on all our perspective when we're working with a patient. So that's why I put this word opportunity here. I've always looked at working with a patient in terms of long-term quitting. And I always have framed it like learning how to ride a bicycle. I think everyone on this call, we at some point when we were kids learned how to ride a bicycle, but none of us got on the bicycle the very first time and just whizzed down the street with our hands up in the air and were able to balance ourselves. We fell off, and probably we fell off many, many times. But the reality is that we figured out what we did right and what we did incorrectly, got back on the bicycle, and finally learned how to do it. So I want you to adopt that. We're looking here at helping these people stay quit long term, which may in fact mean that there may be a few relapses along the way. The important thing is that the individual learn from that so that they can stay quit permanently. Okay, so let's look at some definitions here. Now, I put this on here deliberately because a slip is really different from a relapse. A slip is just an isolated cigarette here and there, or maybe even just one that happens after a quit. And it's because of something very specific that happened to the individual. So you really, in this case, want to hone in on the specific event and then really work with the patient about how to deal with that specific event without smoking a cigarette. However, you also want to deal with the guilt that usually occurs with this. And I think that's very important because in many cases, people think that they should, once they quit, that they'll never, ever, ever have a thought about a cigarette. They'll never be tempted again. And therefore, when they are, they get very guilty. And then that guilt starts to churn around in their heads. And they keep saying, I'm bad, I'm failure, I'm no good, blah, blah, blah. And that turns into a relapse. And a relapse is defined as returning to a regular pattern of smoking, generally on a daily basis, and generally back to the pattern that the person had before they quit. So our role here is to really help refocus them and get them to recommit to quitting. So on this next slide, I'm going to go through a few quick steps that you can go through to help them do this. So these are practical steps. First and foremost, you really want to identify what that first trigger was, whether it was an event or in most cases a thought the person had. Now, I think this is very important because in many cases when people come to you, they're just going to say something like, well, I don't know what happened. I just ended up, with a cigarette in my mouth and I was smoking it, as if it was magically transported there like on Star Trek. The reality, of course, is that there were a lot of decisions that this person made in between thinking about wanting that cigarette and actually smoking it. So when you examine that sequence of events, what you're going to discover and what you want the person to hopefully learn is that there were many spots there where they could have stopped themselves from going to get the cigarette or picking it up or smoking it. So, if somebody has no cigarettes at home, they had to go to the store to buy them. They could have stopped themselves when they put on their coat. They could have stopped themselves when they got out the door. They could have stopped themselves when they got in the car. So that's what I'm kind of talking about, is looking at that sequence and when they could have actually made some attempt to stop the event from happening. And then you want to teach them a specific coping strategy. Now, I think most of the coping strategies here are cognitive because in most cases, people are relapsing because of some thought process. And I kind of call it the 3 Ds. it's usually either a death, a divorce, or a disease that is leading someone to relapse. Um, even 6 months, a year, whenever after they've quit. So there's been some traumatic event in their life, and that's what's causing them to run back to the cigarette, in effect, for comfort. Generally speaking, if a person can make it through the first couple of months, they're going to be okay, and it takes one of these events to precipitate the relapse. It's very rare, other than during the first week or two, and if the person isn't using enough of their cessation medication, that somebody's relapsing because they're having urges, physical urges, for the nicotine. If they're using a product, if they're using it correctly, that's usually not going to happen. So it's really a lot of cognitive stuff that's going on here, so that's what you want to focus on. And once the relapse has happened and the person has come back to you, then you really want to ask this question and really focus on, what did you learn about yourself? And the person may say, well, I told myself I could just have one cigarette, and I really thought I could do that, and now I know I can't. So that's really important that they've learned that for their staying quit long term. So what did you learn about yourself? Now, as far as medications go, in no case, absolutely no case, if somebody has a slip, do you terminate the medication use. 1 or 2 cigarettes here and there isn't going to hurt anybody in terms of their medication. It's not going to cause any kind of problems. With relapse, you really want to look at how committed the person is to quitting again. So it's, in many cases, if the person's only smoking 3 or 4 or 5, or they're doing a few a day, the medication use is okay to continue, because again, they're not going to get nicotine toxicity. There's not going to be any real negative consequence to it. But if the person has really just sort of given up, or they're not in the position to actually quit right then and there, then there's no point in taking the medication. So an example would be, say somebody has a child and the child's in the hospital and with a serious illness, and the person just goes back to smoking, and they're telling you this isn't the right time to do it. I would not continue that person on their medication. However, if somebody says to you, well, I realized what I did, I had a few drinks and I got frustrated with myself and I've been smoking for the last 3 days, they can stay on their medication. So you really need to look at where they're at and what they intend to do. And it's always important to ask the person, okay, are you ready to set another quit day? And really focus on that. If the person says, like, oh, my kid's in the hospital right now and I really can't do it, then your response is, okay, I'm going to check back with you in 2 weeks, or call me when the child gets out of the hospital and we'll revisit it. Don't just let it go. Okay, next slide. So on this final slide here, I've put a few comments that you'll hear from people who have relapsed, and a good way to deal with them. So I hear this a lot, and you may think this is an interesting way to respond, but it does work. So if somebody says to you, I've tried to quit 15 times, your response is, that's fantastic. You've had a lot of, and then stop for a moment, see if they catch on. But the reality is they've had a lot of practice. And as we know, the old saying, practice makes perfect. But in this situation, what I say next is, you've had a lot of practice. You now know what doesn't work for you. Because the reality is, folks, that most people who relapse over and over and over again make the same mistake over and over and over again. So you can then say, you know what? You know what doesn't work. I'm going to show you what does. If they say I'm a failure, then use the riding the bicycle metaphor. Everybody gets that. I think everybody knows how to ride a bicycle. So I think kids are still doing that. So it's a good metaphor to use. And then I really like to do this even before somebody relapses, to prevent it from happening. But if you have somebody that's kind of giving you the message that I don't know, I can do this, I don't think I have what it takes, I'm not able to do this, I always ask the question, what accomplishment in your life are you most proud of? And no matter what they say, so if they said, well, I paid my way through college, or I raised 3 kids, or I climbed this mountain, say to that person, if you can do that, you can quit smoking. Now, I know that may seem very simplistic, but it is simple, but it's powerful. I'll end with this little story. I had a young lady who in the pharmacy school when I was on the faculty there, who had been in school. Then she was in the National Guard. She was deployed in Iraq, came back, and they held her spot in pharmacy school. And so she picked up where she left off. But while she was over there, she started smoking. So the dean talked to her about the fact that she really felt that it was important for her to quit, and that she wasn't being a good role model if she was a pharmacist and smoking. So the dean asked me to work with her, and of course I did. And so she really was quite nervous about quitting, and really had the mindset that she couldn't do this. And so I finally, in talking to her, I said, okay, what did you do when you were in Iraq? And she said, well, I was one of those people that cleared all those landmines out. And she was very proud of that, as she should be. It was a great accomplishment. But as you all know, it was very dangerous. So my comment to her was, if you were able to do that, you're going to be able to quit smoking. And it was one of those interesting things where you remember in cartoons where the light bulb goes off on somebody's head. I literally watched her whole demeanor change. And after thinking about it for like 30 seconds, she says, wow, you're absolutely right. Quitting will be easy compared to that. So it is a simple question, but it can be a very powerful response. So I'm just going to end by saying, this is what to do if a relapse happens, but the whole point of working with somebody once they've quit is to prevent relapse. So you really want to work with them once they're settled into their quit, and once they've been quit for maybe a month or so, and help them identify future situations where they might think they're going to have a problem, and then strategize with them about what they can do, have a plan ready. So strategize with them about what they can do so that you can prevent relapse. Okay, so quick few minutes here. Anybody have any questions about this?
Thanks, Frank. That was perfect. I want to answer one of your questions. Kids do ride bikes. My kids do. And they ride hoverboards. So maybe you have to say, if you've ever ridden a hoverboard and fallen off, then you just have to try again. Yeah.
Sure.
That's
Same
great.
thing. I'm old.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. I love it. But I just wanted you to know you're not that old. Kids still ride bikes. So that's great. Thanks, Frank. Anybody have questions for Frank, or experiences you've had working with patients who've had a slip or a relapse and want to get some input on your experiences or have questions?
I think for us working with seniors, we hear a lot, I've been smoking for, dozens and dozens of years. So I think it's great the tips that Frank gave about some ways to talk to people about their accomplishments over their life and how they've met those accomplishments as a good way to frame like their ability to make those changes, no matter their age.
And just a quick comment, if you hear patients saying that and they're using that as the, that it's not going to matter to their health because they're so old and they've done it for a long time, there's a lot of evidence out there that even if you quit when you're 75 or 80 years old, it's still going to have positive health effects.
Yeah, it's good for some of our clients to see their peers who have quit and been able to maintain it. So that's really helpful as well.
Cool.
That's great.
Agreeing with you, thinking that's a great strategy, not just for someone who's relapsed, but for that initial, because it's so hard sometimes to just make that breakthrough of what's going to touch that person. I was just on another call and we were talking about different ways and different age groups, etc. But I think that's just, one more I'm going to put in my, list of, how do we reach out one more time just to not stop trying until we find that one thing that might inspire somebody. So I've not used that, but I will intend to for sure.
It's good.
Great. Anybody else? Other questions or thoughts? Okay, great. Thank you, Frank.
Steve, I have a personal question for Frank. Frank, you're clearly so good at this. How long did it take you to become as effective and comfortable with smoking cessation as you currently are?
Oh, geez, Steve. Well, as you know, I've been doing this like 34 years now. I do have background. I was trained as a therapist in my master's program, so that definitely helped. But I would have to say, you know, I ran groups, like I was doing 2 or 3 different groups every week for like 5 years on a research study. So maybe, you know, 5, 6, 7 years. But, you know, it's a matter of just doing it and talking to lots of people and, you know, hearing really listening to what they're saying and kind of finding the commonalities among all of them.
Well, thanks so much for sharing all your wisdom and experience.
You're welcome.